Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. Greetings from the ReliefFactor.com studio. It is July the 2nd, 2019. The world is shaky at this moment. Yeah, we may get a deal with China, but China's got a deal with Hong Kong. Here to talk about the disarray around us is the author of A World in Disarray, American Foreign Policy and the Crisis of the Old Order. Richard Haass's book, which came out a year ago, or actually two now, and remains actually incredibly relevant. Richard Haass is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Good morning, Richard. Thanks for joining me early.
Good morning, Mr. Hewitt. How are you?
I am terrific. I am curious what you make of what is happening in Hong Kong. I was there myself, 6 weeks ago, and it was the most orderly of places. There's no trash. There's no dissent. There's no upset. Everything just works, and then all of a sudden the city's in a convulsion.
I was there a few months ago as well. When I was there, it was a little bit depressing. You sensed that the unique character of Hong Kong was beginning to fade, and there was more and more discontent. And when I left, my sense was I wasn't smart enough to know what would trigger something, but I just felt it was on a bad trajectory. And this extradition law that was proposed turned out to be the triggering event. That now has been pulled back. But what's the most interesting is two things. One is that wasn't enough to satisfy the protesters. Their concerns are really fundamental. And it's 20 years after the British handover. They are unhappy by the gradual loss of the autonomous or separate character of Hong Kong. And I think for the mainland, for the people in Beijing, this represents a real threat because it contains with it both precedent, what happens there could happen elsewhere, and it contains with it what you might call the virus of liberalism, which is a real threat to the control of the party, particularly given that this is a party under Xi Jinping that has sought to reconsolidate power at the center. So I actually think this is something to watch. And the stakes now, as big as they are for the 7 or so million people of Hong Kong, I actually think this has real implications for the 1.3 billion people on the mainland.
Now, what China has announced, there will be no compromise. They will not tolerate this sort of public displays of lawlessness. What does that portend in your view, Richard Haass?
Well, the Chinese are going to have to make a choice. Do they crack down, which would be financially disruptive, given that Hong Kong is still in many ways an important financial gateway between the mainland and the world? Or if they don't crack down, they've got a political problem. My guess is if they had to choose, they will crack down. So I think in the first instance, and we're beginning to see signs of it, you're going to see the local police essentially get rougher and rougher. And we'll just have to see how this plays out. But my guess is at the end of the day, the mainland will determine that it will need to do whatever needs doing in order to pressure Hong Kong.
Of course, now that reminds us of Tiananmen Square 30 years ago. We don't know the death toll there. Some people think it's 4 figures, and it was massive in any context. Mm-hmm. Are we looking at a Tiananmen Square in Hong Kong?
Potentially much bigger. This, Tiananmen Square was, localized in many ways geographically, and even if 1,000 plus people died, this potentially is, much larger. It's not in the center of Beijing in a hallowed space, but this is significant, and I think the scale of the protest. We've seen millions of people out in the streets. A significant percentage of the local population has come out and protested. And so, this could, I'm not saying it will, but this could have a scale that would dwarf Tiananmen.
Now, they've got obviously a secret police network, and they have the new facial recognition technology, and they can impose order in small ways. But you really, as you're pointing out, you really can't control 2 million people, absent Napoleon and his cannon at the Tuileries, right? That's how you control 2 million people, is what the whiff of grape shot began during the French Revolution when Napoleon began his rise to power. The whiff of grape shot here would clear the streets as well. But what does that do to the world economy? And let me just be very selfish for a moment, to the American stock exchange if that happens.
Well, again, my guess is before they started doing large-scale uses of force, you would have things like selective arrests, and they would try to get the leadership to the extent this is an organized movement. Look, this would have if things get really bad in Hong Kong and people don't go to work or can't get to work, it would have a significant effect, I would expect, on the on the Chinese economy. It's the world's second largest, so it would have real implications for Asian and global markets, and we could go down that path. Again, this is I'm not going to sit here and say I'm sanguine, because what's interesting is it's not clear now what the goals are. What's so interesting about this is the longer this goes on, the goals of the opposition in Hong Kong begin to grow. It was one thing when they wanted to roll back an extradition law. They've done that. The real question now is, what do they want? Well, is it to preserve Hong Kong's independent character? What does that exactly mean? What will be the specifics they will demand? And is it likely to be too much for the mainland, for the authorities in Beijing to grant? So we're in an odd space now where it's not clear what will satisfy the people in the street, and it's not clear what the people in the mainland would be prepared to give or to do. So this kind of vagueness means that each side is going to test the other, and we'll just have to see how it plays out. But the potential for this to play out in an ugly way, I think, is real.
Next time I'm talking with Ash Carter. His brand new book, Inside the Five-Sided Box, is fascinating. I don't know if you had a chance to read it yet, Richard, but it may be the best defense secretary memoir, and apologies to Vice President Cheney and Don Rumsfeld and Robert Gates, all of whom I've interviewed, but it's so candid and so unafraid of detail that the layman gets a lot of looks that they otherwise wouldn't get inside of DOD. He has a long chapter on China, and he rejects the Thucydides trap that you and Graham Allison have talked about, especially Graham Allison and your friends both with Ash Carter. But he does note the rise in China of a leadership clique within the PLA, which stresses the century of humiliation that they've gone through and are aggressive around the globe. This Hong Kong business must make that clique angry and more powerful. Am I right?
Well, this is what they've been saying, and China is embattled. It's funny, you mentioned several things. One is Ash Carter, good friend. I'm closer to him than I am to Graham Allison on this. I don't think there's anything inevitable about Thucydides trap, a U.S.-Chinese Cold War, but we are closer to it today than we were when Ash was Secretary of Defense. I think both sides in some ways are mismanaging this relationship, and if we end up there, it will be bad for both countries, and indeed it'll be bad for the world. This is the defining relationship of the 21st century, and all you could say is we're not off to a good start. At the end of the second decade of the century.
We are not off to a good start, but we are off to clarity with Iran. Yesterday, Wendy Sherman, I won't play you the long clip, continued the wake for the JCPOA. It really is kind of sad. They're trying to reanimate a dead body. It's like the parrot in a Monty Python. The parrot is dead. The JCPOA is dead, and they're trying to reanimate it. Now, at what point does the Europeans say, okay, this thing, the John Kerry's dream child is dead? At what point do the Europeans rejoin us in force to bring the Iranians back to the table to get a good deal?
Well, it would have been a lot easier if we hadn't gotten out of it. What I'm hoping out of this, this is the optimist to me, is that the Europeans and the U.S. can come around to the position that we've got to prevent Iran from going down this path, but let's revise the JCPOA. Its principal flaws were two. The constraints were too short-lived. They ought to have been much longer. And the constraints ought to have included missiles
yes,
as well as nuclear material. So let's basically make a deal with the Iranians.
That's it. That's exactly right, Richard Haass. But, if people keep wailing over the death of the JCPOA without admitting it was terminal when it was signed because it did not address the missiles and it did not have a long enough runway for the regime to change, which would have been 30 or 40 years, it's never going to be reanimated. If they want back what was bad, it's never going to happen.
Well, even if you did get it back, it would only be back for a few more years. It's simply not a long-term enough agreement. My own view is that's its principal flaw. But now it's all in play. So here's the opportunity. And the Iranian economy is seriously hurting. Last year and this year, it's estimated to be shrinking by 10%. That gives us considerable leverage. So this administration, it's almost, let me use, if I can, forgive me here for a second, a financial metaphor. This administration, it's like we did an investment. The investment is paid off. At some point, you've got to decide when to take a profit. This administration has invested in this relationship, has put tremendous pressure on Iran. Now is the chance, I believe, to take that pressure and translate it into something lasting. I would love to see the administration challenge the Europeans and say, okay, let's make a new deal. I think the Europeans would sign on to it. During the Obama administration, they were actually tougher than we were on the on the approach to Iran. So I think the French, the Germans, and others would sign on to what I call JCPOA 2.0 or JCPOA Plus. This is the moment to go for it.
Well, it is the moment to get a new deal. I wouldn't rename it for the dead deal. That'd be like saying the League of Nations is back. But, Richard Haass, we agree that if they put missiles in there and a longer time frame, then you've got something worth having. Richard Haass, always a pleasure to talk to you from the Council on Foreign Relations. Ash Carter next hour, because we're serious here on the Hugh Hewitt Show.